The radio call came too late, and that was the first thing Ethan Cole realized as he stood frozen on the edge of the mountain ridge, the wind cutting across his face like broken glass, the snow beneath his boots shifting with every breath the storm took, and somewhere deep below, buried under tons of moving ice and silence, 11 children were still alive. Or at least they had been 10 minutes ago, and that number echoed inside his chest in a way nothing else did, not the cold, not the storm, not even the memory of everything he had lost, because numbers like that didn't fade, they stayed, they carved themselves into your mind until you either did something about it or carried the weight forever, and Ethan had carried enough already, more than any man should. More than any soldier ever admits out loud, and yet here he was again, standing in the middle of another impossible situation, except this time he wasn't wearing a uniform, wasn't part of a team, wasn't backed by command or strategy or extraction plans. He was just a man who had been honorably discharged and quietly forgotten, a name that once meant something reduced to a file buried in a system that had moved on without him, and for months he had lived that way, invisible, detached, drifting through a world that didn't need him anymore, except for one thing that never left his side, never questioned his silence, never turned away when everything else did. Ghost, his white German shepherd, standing just a few feet ahead now, his body tense, ears locked forward, icy blue eyes scanning the snowfield below as if he could see through it, as if he could hear something buried beneath layers of ice and wind and time. And Ethan followed his gaze slowly, his breath steady but controlled, because even now, even after everything, his instincts hadn't left him, they never did. They just waited for a reason to come back, and this was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for, and below them the mountains stretched into chaos, a wide field of broken snow where the avalanche had torn through everything in its path. Trees snapped like matchsticks, the ground uneven and unstable, the kind of terrain that swallowed people whole without leaving a trace, and the storm wasn't helping, it was building, pushing harder, covering what little evidence remained, erasing the last signs of movement, the last signs of life. And Ethan knew what that meant. It meant time wasn't just limited, it was disappearing, and every second they stood still was another second those kids lost beneath the snow. And somewhere behind him voices echoed faintly, rescue teams shouting into radios, coordinating positions, arguing about safety protocols, about waiting for conditions to stabilize, about doing things the right way. But Ethan didn't turn back, didn't listen, because he had heard those conversations before, in different places, in different situations, and they always ended the same way, too late, too careful, too slow, and that wasn't something he could accept, not anymore. Not after everything. And Ghost moved then, sudden but controlled, stepping forward toward the slope, his paws cutting into the snow with precision, not reckless, not random, but directed. And Ethan watched him closely, because he knew that movement, knew that focus. Ghost wasn't searching, he had found something, something specific, and Ethan felt it immediately, that shift inside him, the same one that used to happen before a mission, before everything narrowed down to a single objective, and he stepped forward without hesitation, ignoring the voices behind him, ignoring the risk. Because this wasn't about him anymore, it wasn't about proving anything, it wasn't about the past or the discharge or the way the world had moved on without him. It was about those 11 kids buried somewhere beneath that snow, waiting for someone to find them before it was too late. And Ghost picked up speed, moving down the slope with controlled urgency, his body low, his movements efficient, and Ethan followed, his boots digging into the snow, his balance steady despite the unstable ground, his mind already calculating distances, depths, possibilities, because that part of him never left, it just waited for a reason to come back. And halfway down the slope Ghost stopped suddenly, his body locking into place, his head lowering, his nose pressing into the snow, and Ethan slowed immediately. Dropping to one knee beside him, his hand brushing across the surface, feeling the density, the subtle difference in texture, and there it was, faint but real, a disturbance, a pocket, something beneath the surface that didn't belong, and his chest tightened, not from fear, but from confirmation. They were here. This was one of them, and Ghost began digging instantly, his paws moving fast but controlled, throwing snow behind him as Ethan pulled a small shovel from his pack, joining in without hesitation, the rhythm automatic, practiced, efficient, and the storm roared louder around them, pushing harder, trying to bury the moment before it could unfold. But Ethan didn't stop, didn't slow, because he had been in worse, he had worked through worse, and this time he wasn't leaving anyone behind, not again, not ever, and the snow gave way slowly, inch by inch, until something appeared, a small shape, a glove, barely visible beneath the ice, and Ethan's breath caught for just a second. Before he pushed harder, faster, clearing more, revealing a small arm, then a body, and he reached down carefully, pulling the child free, checking quickly, breathing, faint but there, alive, and something shifted inside him in that moment, something he hadn't felt in a long time, something stronger than pain, stronger than memory. It was purpose, raw and undeniable, and Ghost moved again before Ethan could even process it, already heading toward another spot, already searching for the next one, and Ethan looked down at the child in his arms, then back at the mountain, at the storm, at the endless field of snow that still held 10 more lives beneath it, and he stood up slowly, his grip tightening just slightly as he turned toward the next point Ghost had found, because this wasn't over, not even close, and somewhere beneath that storm, 10 more children were still waiting, and Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty: he wasn't leaving that mountain until he found every single one of them. Ethan didn't waste a single second after pulling the first child free, because in a storm like this, survival wasn't measured in minutes, it was measured in moments, and every moment counted against them, and he moved with the same controlled urgency that had once defined his entire life, except now it wasn't orders driving him, it wasn't a mission briefing or a chain of command, it was something far more personal. Something that had been buried under months of silence and isolation and had just been ripped back to the surface by the sight of that small, frozen hand breaking through the snow, and he carried the child carefully but quickly toward a slightly higher ridge where the wind hit less aggressively, placing him behind a broken tree trunk that offered minimal shelter but enough to keep him from being immediately buried again, and he didn't linger, didn't check twice, because Ghost was already moving, already pulling him toward the next location. And Ethan trusted that more than anything else, because Ghost didn't guess, he knew, he felt something deeper, something that cut through the noise and chaos and led straight to what mattered, and Ethan followed, his body adjusting automatically to the uneven terrain, his mind already calculating patterns, angles, the likely spread of the avalanche based on its direction and force, because this wasn't random, avalanches followed rules, even in chaos. And if he could understand those rules, he could predict where the others might be buried, and Ghost stopped again, this time sharper, more urgent, his paws already tearing into the snow before Ethan even dropped to his knees beside him, and the digging began again, faster now, more intense, because the first rescue had changed everything, it had confirmed what was at stake. It had ignited something inside him that refused to slow down, and the snow resisted at first, packed tighter here, heavier, and Ethan had to drive the shovel harder, deeper, forcing each movement with precision, and then it broke, just enough, revealing another shape beneath, smaller than the first, and his chest tightened again as he cleared it carefully, revealing a second child, unconscious but breathing, barely, and he pulled him free, checking quickly, confirming life, and for a split second his hands paused, not from hesitation, but from the weight of it. 2 down, 9 still buried, and the storm wasn't easing, if anything it was getting worse, the wind rising, the snow thickening, reducing visibility to almost nothing, and somewhere above, faint voices called out again, rescue teams shouting warnings, telling him to pull back, telling him conditions were too dangerous, that secondary slides were likely, that continuing was a risk they couldn't afford, but Ethan didn't respond, didn't even look up, because he had already made his decision the moment he stepped onto that slope, and Ghost moved again, faster this time, almost urgent, his body cutting through the snow with purpose, and Ethan followed without question, placing the second child beside the first, securing them as best he could before turning back toward the storm, because there was no time to wait, no time to think about what could go wrong. Only time to act, and the third location came quicker. Ghost barely slowing before dropping into a dig, and Ethan joined him instantly, his movements now completely synchronized with the dog's, A rhythm built over years of working together in environments just as unforgiving as this. And the snow gave way again, revealing another body, and then another just feet away, buried close together, likely caught in the same flow of the avalanche, and Ethan's pace increased, his breathing heavier now but controlled, his muscles burning against the cold and resistance. But he couldn't stop, because every child he pulled free wasn't just a life saved, it was a reminder of why he was still here, why he hadn't disappeared completely into that quiet emptiness after being discharged. Why Ghost had never left his side, and why moments like this still mattered more than anything else. And as he worked, something else began to form in the back of his mind, something darker, something he hadn't fully processed yet, because this avalanche didn't feel right, the spread was too wide, the impact too sudden, the way it had hit the area where those children were gathered didn't match what he knew about natural slides, and that thought lingered as he pulled the fourth child free, then the fifth. Each one adding to the urgency, to the pressure building in his chest, because if this wasn't natural, if something had triggered it, then there was more at play here than just survival. And Ghost paused for just a second after the fifth rescue, his head lifting, his ears shifting slightly as if he had picked up something beyond the immediate search, something distant, something that didn't belong to the storm or the buried children, and Ethan noticed it instantly. Because he knew that look, knew that shift, Ghost wasn't just tracking scent anymore, he was reacting to something else, and Ethan followed his gaze, squinting through the snow, trying to see what the dog saw. But the storm made it almost impossible, just shapes, shadows, movement that could have been anything, and then Ghost turned back sharply, his focus returning to the ground, to the next location, and Ethan pushed the thought aside, forcing himself back into the moment, because whatever else was out there didn't matter yet, not until those 11 children were accounted for, and he dropped to his knees again, digging into the snow with everything he had left, because time was running out. The storm was closing in, and somewhere beneath all of it, 6 more lives were still waiting. And he wasn't about to let the mountain take them too. The wind didn't just howl anymore, it screamed, tearing across the mountain like something alive, something angry, and Ethan felt it in every movement, every breath, every step he forced into the unstable snow as his body began to reach that edge where exhaustion tried to slow him down. But he didn't let it, because slowing down meant losing time. And losing time meant losing them. And he had already pulled 5 children out of the avalanche's grip, 5 fragile lives hanging on the edge of survival, but 6 were still buried, still trapped somewhere beneath layers of snow that were growing heavier with every passing minute, and Ghost didn't stop, not once, his white form cutting through the storm like a signal in the chaos, his movements sharper now, faster, almost urgent in a way Ethan had never seen before, like he wasn't just searching anymore, like he was racing against something, and Ethan followed without question, his boots slipping once as the ground shifted beneath him, forcing him to drop his weight lower to maintain balance, because the slope was becoming unstable again, the kind of instability that meant the mountain wasn't finished yet, that it could move again at any moment, and that thought pressed hard against the back of his mind. But he pushed it aside, because fear didn't help here, hesitation didn't save lives, action did. And Ghost stopped again, digging immediately. Snow flying behind him in fast, controlled bursts, and Ethan dropped beside him. His shovel cutting into the surface, his hands moving faster than before, driven by something deeper than training, something raw, something that refused to let him stop, and the snow broke again, revealing another child, smaller than the others, barely visible beneath the ice, and Ethan's chest tightened. As he cleared the area carefully, pulling the child free, checking quickly, breath shallow but present, and he exhaled sharply, a brief release before pushing forward again, because there was no time to feel anything fully, no time to process the weight of what he was doing, only time to keep moving, and Ghost had already shifted, already heading toward another point, and Ethan followed, his body moving on instinct now. His mind mapping the avalanche spread more clearly with each rescue. Understanding the pattern, the way the snow had carried them, the way it had deposited them in clusters rather than scattering them completely, and that helped, it gave him direction, it narrowed the search, but it also confirmed something else, something darker, because the way the snow had moved, The way it had collapsed so suddenly, so violently, it didn't feel natural, not entirely, and that thought came back stronger now, refusing to stay buried. And as he reached the next location with Ghost already digging, Ethan forced himself to focus again, pushing the doubt aside, because questions didn't matter yet, only action did, and the seventh child came up faster, closer to the surface, as if they had been pushed upward by the force of the avalanche, and Ethan pulled them free, checking quickly, then moving on, because Ghost had already moved again, and this time the dog didn't go far, just a few feet, stopping sharply, digging with more urgency than before, his movements almost frantic now, and Ethan felt it instantly, that shift, that change, because this wasn't just another find, this was something different, something more critical, and he dropped to his knees beside Ghost, his shovel cutting deeper, faster, the snow heavier here, packed tighter, resisting every movement, and his arms burned as he forced through it, ignoring the pain, ignoring the cold, ignoring everything except the need to reach whatever was beneath. And then his hand hit something, not soft like before, not clothing, but something harder, something solid, and his breath caught as he cleared more snow, revealing a small protective barrier, a piece of debris, likely part of a collapsed structure, and beneath it, barely visible, two small forms, pressed together, shielded just enough to survive but trapped in a space that was closing in with every second. And Ethan's heart pounded harder now, because this wasn't just about pulling them out, this was about doing it carefully, precisely, because one wrong move could collapse the pocket, could take away the little air they had left, and he dropped the shovel immediately, using his hands instead, clearing snow slowly, carefully, his fingers numb but controlled, while Ghost stayed close. His body tense but still, as if he understood the stakes. As if he knew this moment required more than speed, it required control, and Ethan worked through it inch by inch, clearing enough space to reach inside, his hands sliding carefully beneath the debris, lifting it just enough to create an opening, and then he reached in, pulling the first child free, then the second, both barely conscious but breathing, and he exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and urgency, because that brought the count to 9. 9 children pulled from the avalanche, 9 lives. Still holding on, and only 2 left, but the storm wasn't easing, if anything it was building again, the wind shifting direction, the snow coming down harder, reducing visibility even further, and somewhere above, a deep rumble echoed faintly, almost lost in the noise of the storm, but Ethan heard it. Felt it, because he knew that sound, knew what it meant, and his entire body tensed instantly, because that wasn't just the storm, that was the mountain moving again. A second avalanche building somewhere above them, and his head snapped upward, his eyes scanning the slope, trying to find the source, trying to gauge the direction, the timing, the distance, and Ghost reacted at the same moment, his body shifting, his ears locking onto the same sound, and then he turned sharply, not toward the slope, but toward a direction Ethan hadn't considered yet, and he moved fast, faster than before, cutting across the terrain instead of following the previous pattern, and Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his instincts clashing, because every calculation he had made pointed elsewhere, but Ghost didn't slow, didn't question, and that was enough, because Ethan had learned one thing over the years. When Ghost moved like that, you followed, no matter what your mind told you, and he grabbed the 2 children, securing them as best he could before pushing forward again, his body moving faster now, driven not just by urgency but by the growing realization that time wasn't just running out, it was about to collapse on top of them, and somewhere ahead, beneath that shifting snow, the last 2 children were still waiting, and the mountain was already beginning to move again. The sound didn't stay distant for long, it grew, deep and rolling, like the mountain itself was tearing loose from its foundation, and Ethan felt it before he fully saw it. A vibration through the snow beneath his boots that sent a sharp warning straight through his body, the kind of signal you don't ignore if you want to survive, and his instincts surged instantly, calculating angles, escape routes, impact zones. But none of it mattered if he didn't find those last 2 children, because leaving now meant abandoning them to whatever was coming down that slope, and that wasn't something he could live with, not after everything he had already pulled them through, not after Ghost had led him this far. And Ghost was already moving faster now, cutting across the snow in a direction that didn't match the previous search pattern, his body low, powerful, driven by something deeper than sight or scent, and Ethan followed hard. Pushing his legs through the resistance, his breath sharp in the freezing air, his muscles burning as the slope shifted unevenly beneath him, and the wind howled louder, carrying with it the first visible signs of the second avalanche beginning to break, snow tearing loose higher up, cascading down in wide sheets that would soon turn into a full collapse. And Ethan didn't look back again, not now, because looking back meant slowing down, and slowing down meant losing them, and Ghost stopped suddenly. Sharper than before, almost sliding into position as his paws dug into the snow, and he began digging immediately, fast and aggressive, his movements urgent in a way Ethan had never seen before, and Ethan dropped beside him without hesitation, his shovel cutting into the snow with everything he had left, the rhythm gone now, replaced by pure force, because time had shifted from limited to critical, and the snow here was deeper, heavier, packed tight from the previous slide, resisting every movement, and Ethan drove through it anyway, his arms shaking under the strain, his breath coming harder now, faster, but controlled enough to keep going, and then Ghost barked once, sharp and low, a sound he rarely made unless something was right there, and Ethan's focus snapped tighter, his movements becoming more precise, more targeted, and he cleared the top layer faster, revealing a faint shape beneath, and his chest tightened instantly as he saw it, a small figure curled slightly, partially shielded by a thin pocket of air that was already collapsing, and he dropped the shovel again, using his hands, digging carefully but fast, clearing the snow around the child's face first, ensuring air, ensuring breath, and then he pulled them free, lifting them into his arms, checking quickly, breathing weak but there, and relief hit hard but only for a second, because one was still missing, one more child still buried somewhere beneath this shifting field, and the mountain above them cracked louder now, the sound splitting through the storm like a warning that was already too late, and Ethan's head snapped up just long enough to see it, the upper ridge breaking apart, snow beginning to move in wide sheets that would soon collapse into a full avalanche, and his body reacted instantly. His mind calculating the impact zone, the direction, the speed, and it was coming straight toward them, and Ghost moved again before Ethan could even process the full path, turning sharply to the left, sprinting across the slope with everything he had, not away from the avalanche, but towards something else, and Ethan didn't question it, didn't hesitate, because by now he understood, Ghost wasn't just leading him to the children, he was keeping them alive, and Ethan followed hard, carrying the child close against his chest, his legs pushing through the snow with everything he had left, the wind hitting harder now, the sound behind them growing louder, closer, the avalanche building into a full roar that filled the entire mountain, and Ghost stopped again, this time near a cluster of broken trees, his paws digging into the snow immediately, faster than before, almost desperate, and Ethan dropped beside him, his hands already moving, his mind focused on one thing only, find the last one, because if they didn't find them now, they wouldn't get another chance, and the snow here was uneven, disturbed, likely shifted by debris from the avalanche, making it harder to read, harder to predict, but Ghost didn't slow, didn't question, and Ethan trusted that completely. Pushing through the snow with everything he had, his fingers numb now, his arms burning, but he kept going, because stopping wasn't an option, not now, not with seconds left, and then his hand hit something, soft, small, and his breath caught as he cleared the snow quickly, revealing the last child, partially buried beneath a layer of debris, their face barely visible, and he moved faster now, pulling them free, checking immediately, breath faint but there, alive, and relief hit hard, stronger than anything else. Because that was it, all 11, every single one of them. And for a split second the world seemed to pause, just enough for that realization to settle, and then the mountain came down, the sound exploding behind them as the avalanche fully broke, a wall of snow and ice rushing toward them with unstoppable force, and Ethan didn't think, didn't calculate, he reacted, turning sharply in the direction Ghost had already moved, sprinting toward the cluster of trees, his body pushing past the limits of exhaustion, past the pain, past everything, because now it wasn't about finding them, It was about surviving with them, and Ghost reached the trees first, darting between them, finding a narrow gap where the terrain dipped slightly, creating just enough cover to shield them from the full force of the slide, and Ethan followed, dropping into that space, pulling the child close, his body curling over them to protect them as much as possible, and the avalanche hit seconds later, the sound deafening, the force overwhelming, snow crashing over them, around them, filling the air with cold and pressure and chaos, and Ethan held his position, his grip tight, his body locked, because this was the moment that decided everything, whether they had made it far enough, whether Ghost had led them to the right place, whether all 11 lives would make it off this mountain, or be buried again beneath it. And in that crushing silence that followed the initial impact, with the weight of the snow settling around them and the world reduced to darkness and pressure, Ethan waited, his breath steady, his body still, listening for one thing only: movement. For a few seconds there was nothing, no sound, no movement, no wind, just a suffocating stillness pressed in from every direction, the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful but heavy, like the world itself has stopped breathing. And Ethan held that position without moving, his body curved protectively over the child in his arms, his face pressed into the cold fabric of their jacket, his lungs tight as he forced himself to stay calm, because panic in a moment like this was deadly. Panic wasted oxygen, wasted time, and time was the one thing they didn't have much of. And slowly, carefully, he shifted his head just enough to test the space around him, his cheek brushing against packed snow, dense but not completely solid, and that alone told him something important. They weren't fully buried, not completely trapped. Ghost had found a pocket, a narrow gap where the terrain had absorbed part of the impact, enough to keep them from being crushed under the full weight of the avalanche. And Ethan exhaled slowly, controlled, letting just a small amount of air escape before drawing in another breath, testing the air, making sure it was still there, still moving. And it was, faint but enough. And then he listened, pushing past the ringing in his ears, focusing on anything beyond his own breathing. And there it was, faint but unmistakable, a soft movement to his left, a low sound that cut through the silence like a signal, and his chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. Ghost. And Ethan shifted again, carefully this time, his arm moving just enough to feel for him, his fingers brushing against fur, cold but solid, and Ghost responded immediately, a small movement, a low breath that confirmed he was alive, still there, still with him, and that grounded Ethan in a way nothing else could, because if Ghost had survived that impact, if he had stayed close through all of it, then they still had a chance. And Ethan pushed himself up slowly, breaking through the top layer of snow with controlled force, his shoulders rising first, then his head, forcing space into existence, and cold air rushed in instantly, sharp and biting but clean, and he took it in carefully, not too fast, steady, controlled, because too much too quickly could do just as much harm. And he looked around, his vision adjusting to the dim light filtering through the storm, and what he saw confirmed everything. The trees had taken the worst of the impact, broken and bent under the force, but still standing enough to create that pocket, that narrow space where they had survived, and the snow around them was deep, uneven, still shifting slightly as the last of the avalanche settled into place. And Ethan moved quickly now, pushing himself fully upright, lifting the child in his arms, checking them immediately, their breathing still there, faint but steady, and he turned, scanning the area, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion pulling at his body, because this wasn't over, not yet. The avalanche might have passed, but the danger hadn't, not until all 11 children were accounted for again, not until he could confirm that none of them had been buried a second time, and Ghost was already moving, shaking the snow from his fur, his body low but steady, his eyes locked onto Ethan for just a second before shifting outward, scanning the area with that same focused intensity. And Ethan didn't need words to understand. They had to move, they had to check the others, and he stepped out of the pocket carefully, his boots sinking deep into the snow, forcing him to adjust his balance with each step, and he moved toward the ridge where he had placed the first group, his pace slower now, controlled, because the terrain was even more unstable after the second slide, and as he reached the spot, his chest tightened again, because the tree trunk he had used for shelter was partially buried now, covered by a new layer of snow that hadn't been there before, and for a split second the worst thought hit him. Sharp and immediate, that they had been buried again, that everything he had done had just been undone in seconds, and he dropped to his knees instantly, clearing the snow with his hands fast but controlled, his breath tightening with each movement, and then it broke, revealing a small arm, then another, and relief hit hard as he pulled them free, one by one, checking each quickly, confirming breathing, confirming life, and Ghost moved between them, his nose brushing against each child briefly as if checking for himself, as if making sure they were still there, still alive, and Ethan worked through them methodically, counting as he went, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then he turned, his eyes scanning for the last two he had just rescued before the second avalanche hit, and for a moment he didn't see them, just snow, just broken branches, just the aftermath of the collapse, and his chest tightened again, sharper this time, because losing them now, after everything, wasn't something he could accept, and Ghost reacted instantly, his body shifting, his ears locking onto a direction just a few feet away, and he moved fast, digging into the snow with urgency. And Ethan followed immediately, dropping beside him, his hands already moving, pushing through the fresh layer of snow, and it didn't take long, just seconds, before he found them, both children still where he had left them, partially covered but alive, and he exhaled sharply, the tension in his chest releasing just enough to keep him moving, because now they were all there, all 11, accounted for, breathing, alive. And for a brief moment, standing in the middle of that broken mountain, surrounded by snow and silence and the aftermath of something that should have taken them all, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something steady, something real. It wasn't relief alone, it was purpose, and it grounded him completely, because now the mission had shifted again. It wasn't about finding them anymore, it was about getting them off this mountain alive, and that was going to be just as hard. Because the storm wasn't gone, the terrain wasn't safe, and somewhere beyond the ridge, the rescue teams were still waiting, still arguing, still deciding whether it was safe to move, and Ethan looked down at the 11 children around him, then at Ghost, standing steady beside him, and he knew one thing for certain: waiting wasn't an option, not anymore, because if they stayed here, the mountain would take them eventually, and this time, he wasn't going to give it the chance. Ethan didn't allow himself more than a few seconds to feel anything after confirming all 11 were alive, because survival on a mountain like this wasn't about what you had already done, it was about what you did next, and the next step was always the hardest one, getting them out. And he stood slowly, his body stiff from the impact and the cold, his muscles tight but still responsive, still ready. And he looked out across the slope, the storm shifting again, the wind no longer screaming but still strong enough to erase tracks and bury movement if they didn't keep going, and the path back to the ridge where the rescue teams had last been positioned was no longer clear. The avalanche had changed everything, the terrain was different now, unfamiliar, dangerous in ways that couldn't be predicted. And Ethan understood that immediately, because he had seen landscapes like this before. Places where one wrong step could trigger another collapse, where the ground beneath you wasn't as solid as it looked, and where hesitation could be just as deadly as moving too fast. And he turned toward Ghost, meeting his eyes for a second, and that was enough, no words, no commands, just understanding, because Ghost had already started scanning, already mapping a path through instinct and awareness that went beyond anything Ethan could calculate in this visibility, and the dog moved first, stepping carefully across the snow, testing each patch before committing his weight, his body low and controlled, and Ethan followed, but not before making a quick decision, one that would define whether they made it off this mountain or not, and he moved quickly between the children, adjusting their positions, grouping them in a way that minimized exposure, pairing the stronger ones with the weaker, creating a formation that would allow him to move them as a unit instead of individually, because carrying them one by one wasn't an option anymore, not with the terrain shifting and the storm closing in again, and he used what he had, pieces of gear, straps, broken branches from the trees, forming makeshift supports, something to help them stay upright, to keep them moving, even if it was slow, and he spoke then. His voice low but steady, cutting through the wind just enough to reach them, not as a command, not as an order, but as something else, something grounded. "Stay close, don't stop, no matter what." And some of them responded, faint nods, small movements, while others barely reacted, too weak, too cold, too exhausted to fully understand. But that didn't matter. He would carry them if he had to, he would drag them if it came to that. Because none of them were staying on this mountain, not after everything they had just survived, and Ghost moved ahead slowly, his path deliberate, avoiding steeper sections, cutting across the slope instead of going straight up, choosing stability over speed, and Ethan followed, guiding the children behind him, his body constantly shifting, adjusting, catching those who stumbled, pulling those who lagged, his attention split between the terrain and the group, because both could fail at any moment, and the wind picked up again, blowing snow across their path, reducing visibility to just a few feet, turning everything into a white blur where direction was more instinct than sight, and Ethan felt the pressure building again, not just from the environment, but from something deeper, something that had been lingering since before the second avalanche, that sense that something about this wasn't right, that the way the snow had moved, the timing of the slides, the location of the collapse, it all pointed to something more than natural disaster, and he pushed that thought aside again, because right now it didn't matter why it had happened, only that it had, and that they were still alive in the middle of it, and they needed to keep moving. And Ghost stopped suddenly, not digging this time, but standing still, his body tense. His head lifted slightly as if listening for something beyond the wind, and Ethan froze immediately, his instincts snapping tight, because that kind of stop didn't mean a path, it meant danger, and he turned his head slightly, scanning the slope, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see through the snow, and then he heard it, faint at first, almost lost in the wind, but there, unmistakable, the low mechanical hum of something that didn't belong in a place like this, something distant but moving, and his chest tightened. Because that wasn't the mountain, that wasn't the storm, that was something else, something man-made, and Ghost's posture shifted slightly, not defensive, not aggressive, but alert in a way that suggested awareness, like he recognized the sound but didn't see it as immediate threat, and Ethan followed his gaze, his mind working quickly, trying to place it, trying to understand what it could be, and then it hit him, a helicopter, but not where it should be, not from the direction of the rescue teams, and not moving the way a search aircraft would in conditions like this. And the realization settled heavy in his chest, because if that wasn't rescue, then what was it doing here, and why now, in the middle of a storm that should have grounded everything? And the sound grew slightly louder, closer, cutting through the wind just enough to confirm it, and Ethan's grip tightened on the nearest child, his body shifting instinctively, because whatever that was, whatever was coming toward them, it wasn't part of the plan, and on a mountain like this, anything unplanned was dangerous. And Ghost moved again, not toward the sound, but slightly away from it, guiding the group along a different path, one that kept them lower, closer to the broken tree line where visibility was reduced and cover was better. And Ethan followed without hesitation, because he trusted that instinct more than his own thoughts right now, and as they moved, the sound of the helicopter hovered just out of sight, circling somewhere beyond the ridge, and Ethan felt that same tension build again, sharper now, more focused. Because something about this didn't sit right, not at all, and he knew one thing for certain, getting those 11 children off the mountain had just become a lot more complicated than the storm itself. The sound didn't pass over them the way a rescue helicopter should have, it lingered, circling somewhere beyond the ridge with a patience that didn't match urgency, and that alone was enough to shift something inside Ethan from pure survival mode into something sharper, something colder. The kind of awareness that had once kept him alive in places where the danger didn't always show itself clearly, and he slowed his pace just slightly. Not enough for the children to feel it, but enough for him to listen, to track the movement of the sound, to understand its pattern, because patterns told you intent, and intent told you whether you were safe or not, and Ghost stayed ahead but closer now, no longer pushing forward as aggressively as before. His body angled slightly back toward Ethan as if he was waiting for confirmation, waiting for direction, and Ethan gave it with a small shift of his hand, a subtle signal. And Ghost adjusted immediately, moving them along a lower path that cut through a denser section of broken trees, where the branches hung heavy with snow and visibility dropped even further, and that was exactly what Ethan wanted, because if something was circling above them, he didn't want to be seen, not until he understood what it was, and the children followed as best they could, their movements uneven, some stumbling, some barely able to stay upright, and Ethan moved between them constantly, catching one, steadying another, his voice low and controlled. Keeping them moving, keeping them focused on the next step instead of the fear that was beginning to settle in their eyes, because they could feel it too, not the helicopter, not yet, but the tension, the shift in the air that told them something wasn't right, and the wind dropped for just a moment, just long enough for the sound to come through clearer, closer, the steady rotation of blades cutting through the storm, and Ethan stopped again, just for a second, his head tilting slightly as he listened, and this time he could tell, the movement wasn't random, it was controlled, deliberate, circling a specific area, narrowing its pattern, and his chest tightened as the realization settled in, they weren't searching the mountain. They were searching this section of it, the exact section where the avalanche had hit, and that meant one thing: whoever was in that helicopter knew something about this avalanche that the rescue teams didn't, and that thought hit harder than the cold, because it confirmed what he had been feeling since the first slide. This wasn't just natural, and Ghost shifted again, his body lowering slightly as he moved them deeper into the trees, choosing paths that kept them covered, and Ethan followed. His mind now split between two priorities: getting the children to safety and staying out of sight, because if that helicopter wasn't rescue, then being seen wasn't an option, not until he knew what they wanted. And the terrain changed as they moved, the slope easing slightly, the snow less unstable here, packed tighter between the trees, and that gave Ethan a small advantage, a chance to move faster without risking another collapse, and he pushed them forward, his pace increasing just enough to cover more ground, to put distance between them and the open slope, and behind him one of the children stumbled hard, dropping to their knees, their strength finally giving out, and Ethan turned instantly, lifting them back up, his grip firm but careful, and he looked into their face for just a second, just long enough to see the fear, the exhaustion, the way their body was beginning to shut down, and he made a decision in that moment, quick and final, and he shifted the child onto his back, securing them with one arm while keeping the other free, because slowing down for one meant risking all of them, but leaving one wasn't an option either, not ever, and Ghost paused ahead, waiting until Ethan was moving again before continuing, adjusting his pace to match. And the sound of the helicopter grew louder again, closer now, and then for the first time, through a break in the trees, Ethan saw it, a dark shape cutting through the snow above the ridge, low enough to be searching, but not marked the way a rescue aircraft should have been, no visible identification, no clear signal lights beyond what was necessary for flight, and it hovered briefly before shifting position again, scanning the area with controlled movement, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, because that confirmed it. This wasn't rescue, this was something else entirely, and his instincts sharpened further, his movements more precise, more controlled, because now the mountain wasn't the only threat, and he pushed the group deeper into the tree line, aiming for a narrow path he remembered from earlier, a route that led toward a lower valley where the terrain flattened out just enough to give them a chance to regroup, and as they moved, the helicopter shifted again, its path adjusting, drifting closer to their position. And Ethan felt it immediately, that tightening in his chest, that signal that told him they were no longer just avoiding it, they were being tracked, and Ghost stopped suddenly, turning back toward Ethan with a look he had only seen a few times before, one that meant immediate change, immediate action, and Ethan understood without hesitation, whatever was coming next, they weren't going to outrun it by moving the way they had been, and the mountain, the storm, and now whatever was circling above them were all closing in at the same time, and for the first time since he stepped onto that slope, Ethan realized this wasn't just a rescue anymore, it was something much bigger, something he hadn't been prepared for. And the only thing standing between those 11 children, and whatever was coming, was him and Ghost. Ethan didn't stop moving, but something inside him shifted completely, the moment he realized they weren't just surviving the mountain anymore, they were being hunted within it, and that realization sharpened every instinct he had left, cutting through the exhaustion, the cold, the weight of the children depending on him, because this was familiar territory in a way the storm never was. This was controlled danger. Calculated movement, someone out there making decisions with intent, and intent could be read, predicted, countered, and he slowed the group just enough to bring them closer together, tighter, more controlled, because spreading out made them easier to track, easier to isolate, and he lowered his voice again, calm but firm. "Stay close to me, no matter what." And even the weakest among them responded to the tone, because there was something in it that didn't leave room for doubt, something steady that cut through fear, and Ghost moved ahead but not far, his pace adjusted. His movements more deliberate now, no longer just leading but scanning, constantly checking their surroundings, and Ethan watched him closely, because Ghost picked up things faster than any human could, subtle changes, distant sounds, shifts in movement that didn't belong, and the helicopter above shifted again, its sound cutting through the trees in uneven patterns, moving slower now, more controlled, and Ethan knew exactly what that meant. Whoever was up there had narrowed their search, they were focusing, and he felt that pressure build again, because the window to move unseen was closing fast, and he adjusted their path again, steering them toward a narrow cut between two ridges where the terrain dipped sharply, creating a natural blind spot from above, and it wasn't easy. The slope there was uneven, the snow packed hard in some places and dangerously soft in others, forcing him to guide every step, every movement, catching the children when they slipped, lifting them when they couldn't keep up, his body working past its limits now, because stopping wasn't an option, not when something above them was closing in with purpose, and Ghost paused suddenly at the edge of the drop, his body still. His head angled slightly as he scanned below, and Ethan moved up beside him, his eyes following the same line, and what he saw gave him just enough of an advantage to keep going. The terrain below flattened out into a narrow valley, partially shielded by rock and trees, a place where they could move faster, regroup, maybe even signal for real rescue if they could get clear of whatever was tracking them, and he didn't hesitate, guiding the children down carefully, step by step, his grip firm on the ones closest to him, while Ghost moved ahead, testing the path, ensuring it held. And the descent was slow but controlled, the kind of movement that required full focus, because one wrong step here could send them sliding into something worse, and halfway down, the wind dropped again, just enough for the sound above to come through clearer than before, and this time it wasn't just the hum of the blades, there was something else, a sharp mechanical tone, intermittent, like a signal being sent or received. And Ethan's chest tightened again, because that wasn't standard, not for rescue, not for anything that belonged in a situation like this, and he pushed the thought aside, forcing himself to keep moving, because analyzing it now wouldn't change anything, not until they were out of range, and they reached the valley floor moments later, the terrain leveling out just enough to allow them to move faster, and Ethan took advantage of it immediately, pushing the group forward, increasing their pace, because distance was their only real defense now, and Ghost picked up speed again, guiding them along the valley edge instead of straight through it, keeping them close to the rock wall where cover was better, and Ethan followed, his body now running on something deeper than strength, something driven by purpose alone. Because those 11 children were still alive, still breathing, and he wasn't about to let anything take that away from them, not the mountain, not the storm, and not whatever was circling above them. And then the sound changed, sharper, closer, and Ethan felt it before he saw it, the shift in the air as the helicopter dropped lower, its movement no longer searching but targeting, and he turned instinctively, his eyes scanning upward through the break in the valley, and there it was, cutting through the snow just above the ridge line, closer than before, too close, and for a split second everything slowed, his mind calculating distance, speed, options, and none of them were good, not here, not exposed like this, and Ghost reacted instantly, his body turning sharply toward a narrow opening in the rock wall, barely visible unless you were looking for it, a tight passage that cut deeper into the mountain, and Ethan didn't question it, didn't hesitate. Because that was their only chance, and he pushed the group toward it, his voice sharper. Now more urgent. Move now! And the children responded as best they could, their fear pushing them forward even when their bodies wanted to stop, and the sound of the helicopter grew louder behind them, closing the distance. And Ethan didn't look back again, because looking back wouldn't change anything, it would only slow them down. And Ghost reached the opening first, slipping through the narrow gap with ease, and Ethan guided the children through one by one, pulling them into the tight passage, the rock walls closing in around them, cutting off the wind, muffling the sound above just enough to give them a moment. And he was the last to enter, turning just briefly as he did, catching one final glimpse of the helicopter hovering above the valley, its dark shape cutting through the snow, and for the first time he saw it clearly, not rescue markings, not civilian, something else entirely. And the realization hit hard as he stepped into the passage, because whatever had caused that avalanche, whatever had drawn them to this mountain, it wasn't over, not even close, and now they were deeper in it than ever before. The moment Ethan stepped fully into the narrow rock passage, the world outside seemed to collapse into a distant memory, the roar of the wind fading into a low, muffled hum, the blinding white storm replaced by dim shadows and cold stone pressing in from both sides, and for the first time since the avalanche hit, there was a brief, fragile sense of stillness. But it wasn't safety, not yet, it was something else, something quieter, more dangerous, because silence like this meant they were no longer just fighting the mountain, they were stepping into something unknown, something hidden beneath it, and Ethan didn't slow down, not even for that moment of calm, because he knew better than to trust it, knew that pauses like this were often the space where things shifted, where danger changed form instead of disappearing, and he guided the children deeper into the passage, his hand steady on the nearest shoulder, his voice low but firm, keeping them moving because stopping here, in a place they didn't understand, wasn't an option, not with whatever was circling above them still searching, still closing in, and Ghost moved ahead but slower now, his posture different, more cautious, his ears shifting with every faint sound that echoed through the narrow space, because this wasn't open terrain anymore, this was confined, controlled, and anything inside here would be harder to see, harder to predict. And Ethan followed that instinct immediately, adjusting his own movement, lowering his center of gravity, his steps quieter, more deliberate, because noise carried differently here, every footstep, every breath, every shift in position echoed off the rock, and he needed to keep that under control, needed to stay aware of everything around them, and the passage curved slightly, leading them deeper into the mountain, the light from outside fading quickly until it was replaced by a dim, cold glow reflecting off the stone, and Ethan reached for the small light clipped to his gear, switching it on just enough to illuminate the path ahead without exposing them too much, and the beam cut through the darkness, revealing rough walls, uneven ground, and something else, something that didn't belong, faint markings along the stone. Subtle but deliberate, lines carved into the surface, not natural, not random, and Ethan slowed just slightly, his eyes tracing them as he passed, because this wasn't just a natural formation, this passage had been used before, shaped, altered, and that realization settled heavily in his chest, because it meant they weren't just hiding from something outside, they were stepping into something that had already been here, long before them, and Ghost stopped again, sharper this time, his body going completely still, his head tilted slightly, as if listening for something deeper within the mountain, and Ethan froze instantly, his instincts snapping tight, his light shifting forward as he scanned the path ahead, and at first there was nothing, just darkness and stone and the faint echo of their own movement, but then it came, subtle, almost imperceptible, a sound that didn't match anything natural, a low mechanical vibration, distant but present. And Ethan's chest tightened again, because that sound didn't belong in a place like this. Not deep inside a mountain, not in the middle of a storm, and Ghost shifted slightly, not retreating, not advancing, just holding position, and that told Ethan everything he needed to know. Whatever was ahead wasn't immediately aggressive, but it wasn't safe either, and he moved forward slowly, carefully, guiding the children behind him, his light cutting a narrow path through the darkness, and the passage widened slightly as they moved deeper, opening into a larger space, and Ethan stepped into it first, his body tense, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, and what he saw made him stop completely, because this wasn't just a cave, it was something else entirely, something constructed, walls reinforced with metal supports. Cables running along the edges, faint lights embedded into the structure, and at the center of it all, a partially hidden installation, old but not abandoned, dormant but not dead, and Ethan's breath slowed slightly as the pieces began to connect: the avalanche, the helicopter, the unnatural patterns in the snow, this place. It wasn't coincidence, it was connected, all of it, and Ghost moved forward slowly, his posture cautious but steady. His eyes locked onto the central structure, and Ethan followed, his mind racing now, because whatever this was, whatever had been built here, it wasn't just part of the mountain, it was part of something much bigger, something that had been hidden, and as he stepped closer, the faint mechanical hum grew stronger, clearer, and the lights along the structure flickered slightly, reacting to their presence in a way that felt almost aware, and the children behind him shifted uneasily, their fear returning, not from the storm this time, but from something they couldn't understand, and Ethan felt it too. That tension, that sense that they had crossed a line they couldn't go back from, and he stopped just a few feet from the structure, his eyes scanning it carefully, his instincts telling him to stay ready, to expect anything, and then Ghost moved again, stepping closer to the surface, his nose brushing lightly against the metal, and the reaction was immediate, the hum shifting, the lights stabilizing, and Ethan's focus snapped tighter, because that wasn't random, that was a response, and whatever this system was, it wasn't completely inactive, and the realization settled hard in his chest, because this wasn't just a hidden place, this was something that had been waiting, something that had been triggered, and somewhere above them. The helicopter still circled, still searching, and Ethan understood in that moment that the storm, the avalanche, everything that had brought them here, it wasn't the real danger, it was just the beginning of something much deeper, something far more controlled, and now they were standing right in the center of it. Ethan didn't step closer to the structure immediately, not because he was afraid of it, but because he understood something most people never did in moments like this, that whatever you were looking at wasn't just what it seemed on the surface, it was a system, a purpose, a design built by someone with intent, and intent always came with consequences, and he stood there for a few seconds, his body still, his breathing controlled, his eyes moving slowly across every detail, the reinforced walls, the cables, the faint lights that had stabilized after Ghost touched the surface, and the low hum that now felt less like background noise and more like something alive, something waiting, and behind him the children remained close, their fear quiet but present, their trust resting entirely on him without them even realizing it, and that weight settled into Ethan in a way that didn't slow him down, it sharpened him. Because this wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about understanding what they had stepped into, and making sure it didn't follow them back out, and Ghost moved again, stepping slightly to the side of the central structure, his head tilted, his ears forward, and Ethan followed that movement, his gaze shifting to where the dog was focused, and there it was, subtle but clear, a control panel partially embedded into the surface, not fully visible unless you were looking for it. And Ethan stepped toward it carefully, his hand hovering just above the surface, because he knew better than to touch something like this without understanding it first, but time wasn't something they had much of, not with whatever was above them still searching, still circling, and he glanced back briefly at the children, then at Ghost, and that was enough, because Ghost had brought him here, had led him through every step of this without hesitation, without error, and Ethan trusted that more than anything else, and he placed his hand on the panel. The reaction was immediate, the hum shifting into something sharper, more defined, the lights along the structure flickering once before stabilizing completely, and for a split second the entire space felt like it had awakened, like something that had been dormant for years had just been brought back online, and Ethan held his position, his body steady, his mind focused, because pulling away now wouldn't undo anything. Whatever had been triggered was already in motion, and the panel beneath his hand responded again, the surface shifting slightly, revealing a deeper layer, something hidden beneath the outer shell, and Ethan adjusted his grip, applying controlled pressure, not forcing it, not rushing, because this wasn't about strength, it was about precision, and Ghost stepped closer, his body pressing lightly against Ethan's side, grounding him, anchoring him in the moment, and the hum changed again, lower now, steadier. and the faint vibration in the ground beneath them began to fade. And Ethan felt it instantly, that shift, the same kind of shift he had felt on missions when something critical changed, when the situation moved from unstable to controlled, and he glanced up briefly, his eyes scanning the structure, the lights now steady, the patterns along the surface simplified, no longer chaotic, and behind him one of the children spoke for the first time since they had entered the passage, a small, quiet voice that carried more weight than anything else in that moment. "It's stopping." And Ethan didn't respond immediately, because he was already feeling it, the tension in the air easing, the subtle pressure that had been building since the avalanche finally releasing, and he pushed the panel one last time, firm but controlled, and the system responded fully, the hum dropping into a faint, stable tone, the lights dimming slightly as if settling into a dormant state. And the vibration in the ground disappeared completely. For a moment, everything was still. No wind, no shifting snow, no distant mechanical sound, just silence, real silence, the kind that didn't feel heavy or threatening, but calm, balanced, and Ethan slowly removed his hand from the panel, stepping back just slightly as he scanned the structure again, looking for any sign of instability, any reaction that suggested this wasn't finished, but there was nothing, just stillness, and he exhaled quietly. The first real breath he had taken since stepping onto that mountain, because whatever this was, whatever had triggered the avalanche, whatever had drawn that helicopter here, it had just been shut down, or at least interrupted enough to stop it from continuing, and he turned back toward the children, his posture shifting slightly, the tension easing just enough to let something else come through, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel until now, and he moved toward them, his voice softer but steady. "We're leaving." And this time they all responded, small movements. Quiet nods, but present, aware, alive in a way they hadn't been when he first found them buried beneath the snow. Ghost moved first, turning toward the passage they had entered from, his pace calm now, no urgency, no tension, just direction, and Ethan followed, guiding the children behind him, his body still alert, still ready, because leaving this place didn't mean it was completely safe, but it meant they had done what they came here to do, even if they hadn't known it at the time, and they moved back through the narrow passage. The light from outside growing stronger with each step, and when Ethan stepped out into the open air again, the difference was immediate. The storm had changed, not gone completely, but calmer, the wind reduced to a steady push instead of a violent force, the snow falling in controlled patterns instead of chaotic waves, and he looked out across the mountain, the landscape no longer shifting unpredictably, no longer carrying that unnatural tension, just a storm returning to its natural state. And he turned slightly, scanning the sky, and the helicopter was gone. Completely gone, no sound, no movement, no sign it had ever been there, and that told him everything he needed to know. Whatever had drawn it here had been connected to that system, and now that the system was quiet, it had no reason to stay. Ethan stood there for a moment, the cold air hitting his face, the weight of everything finally settling into something he could process, and he looked down at the children, all 11 of them, standing, breathing, alive, and Ghost stepped beside him, his white fur catching the light of the snow, his presence steady as always, and Ethan placed his hand briefly on the dog's neck, a silent acknowledgement. Because none of this would have happened without him, none of it, and as they began to walk down the mountain together, moving toward where real rescue would finally meet them, Ethan understood something clearly, something that stayed with him long after the storm had passed, long after the reports were written and the world moved on again, that being forgotten didn't mean being finished, it didn't mean your purpose was gone, sometimes it just meant you hadn't reached the moment you were meant for yet, and when that moment came, it didn't ask who you used to be, it asked what you were willing to do now, and Ethan had answered that question the only way he knew how, by stepping forward when everyone else stepped back, by trusting the one thing that had never left him, and by refusing to leave anyone behind, no matter what it cost. And as the mountain finally fell silent behind them, he knew one thing for certain: this time, he hadn't been forgotten at all.